Again, that would increase supply to ensure that bills can come down. And the third thing I would just point out, actually, just while I'm on a roll with some of these items, what we're not going to do is limit supply by cutting off critical oil and gas production that we are going to need to both transition to a cleaner economy, but that we're going to rely on for fueling and powering our homes and businesses for many years to come. We're being very clear about that. That's why we welcomed the announcement on Rosebank in particular. It is vital that we have an oil and gas sector that is able to tap into domestic resources, and that obviously is a clear dividing line with our opposition. So those are the factors that I would just point out to you, but look forward to the discussion.
Great. Mhari.
Hi, Mhari, Aurora, Sky News. Thank you for having me. Obviously, as a journalist, I'm not going to tell the government what to do. I'll leave that to Gareth. But I think what's interesting is, first of all, energy efficiency, insulation. We talk about reducing demand when it comes to energy consumption, but that can be done through our habits and how we live, but it can also be done purely by just allowing our buildings and our homes to be more energy efficient and to essentially lose less heat and waste less heat, so we don't need it. Then we don't have to change our patterns of behaviour. I think that's really important. And I think also when it comes to politics, it's also very important, I think, sometimes that energy policy doesn't become this massively polarised topic where it's seen as left-wing. I mean, we heard literally an hour ago, Claire Coutinho, Energy Secretary, just gave a speech, and she was talking about how Labour are on the side of eco-zealots who, turn energy into a religion, and they're the sensible party when it comes to energy policy. And I don't actually know if that's always massively helpful. Politically, it obviously is, but I think actually taking that kind of party political stance out of it for a second and trying to look at things from a more maybe cross-party common sense approach. For instance, even though he disagrees with Keir Starmer, Gordon Brown said, I think it was last week on Sky News, he actually agreed with the government's policy when it came to the Rosebank oil field. And he was trying to say that actually we need to just be pragmatic and look at jobs and look at phasing out oil and gas in a sensible way. Now, I think both parties could potentially do with a little bit more crossover collaboration communication on energy policy rather than labelling one side as destroying the environment and labelling the other side as eco-zealots who don't know what they're talking about. That, I think, is a bit difficult.
Chris.
No, Chris Norbury, Chief Executive, E.ON UK, thank you for the invitation to be here today and some really interesting comments by the previous panellists. To your question, then, there would be two observations that I would make. One, I think we have both an imperative and an opportunity. The imperative that I see is that this winter we have people in society who are really struggling to pay their energy bills. They continue to struggle with the cost of living. Energy bills remain twice as high as that which they were prior to the energy crisis. And not only have the government support mechanisms fallen away, but also certainly what we see in our debt book is that a section of our customer base have exhausted their reserves, they've exhausted their means of resilience. And much, not dissimilar to Philippe's point, then for a section of our customer base, a section of society, people can no longer afford to pay. We have 100,000 customers who have not paid anything for their energy bill for over a year. What we're doing is we've introduced a winter support scheme this year, for this winter rather. That will be roughly an investment of about £80 million. That will offer families on very low incomes either a 25 or 50% discount on their energy bill, depending on circumstance. So we are doing what we can, but we are limited in what we can do, both in terms of our customer base and our reach, and we believe that there is an imperative for government to do more this winter. The opportunity that we have, I think, is not dissimilar to Mhari's, but the opportunity of a long-term commitment to an investment in energy efficiency in the UK. We have some of the worst quality housing stock in this country in Europe. an investment in energy efficiency would not only reduce people's bills permanently, it would deliver economic benefits to the UK, it would deliver health and social care benefits to the UK, and if you pardon the pun, it would insulate society and it would insulate the Treasury from the risk of future price shocks, which undoubtedly will come because of the, we still have an overdependence on gas in our energy mix. So those would be the two things that I would call out.
Great. Andy.
Thank you. I'm Andy Manning from Citizens Advice. So I'll do some short-term stuff building on Chris's points and then the longer term. So just some evidence on what we're seeing from our clients for this winter. So people contacting us unable to top up their prepayment meters. At this point, we're at 67% increase compared to last year. The people contacting us unable to top up. And it's worth remembering that's off a very high base. So last year, there was more people contacted us in that way than the previous 10 years added together. And then we're seeing a 67% increase on top of that. And also, in terms of energy debt, people contacting us with energy debt. We normally expect to see it reduce as you go through the summer, the natural pattern of things, and we've not seen that reduction at all. So we're expecting people to be starting this winter in a far worse place, and for the winter to be far worse. So to support Chris's call, there's something needs to be done in the short term for this winter. If there is a good aspect, and there isn't probably, but if there's a good aspect of the gas crisis and all the problems it's caused for our clients, I think what it's made clear to me is that for consumers, the route to net zero and the route to affordability is the same path, which has become very clear. So just to pick out some elements from that, we need to make sure that consumers are able to enjoy the cheaper renewables. So breaking this link between renewables and primarily gas-fired power stations. And to build on the points, we also need to embrace energy efficiency with the retrofit. We've done some research that shows the economic benefits of a retrofit programme could deliver 40 billion by 2030. The aspect I don't think we've covered yet is flexibility. So where customers can be flexible in how they use energy, they should be fully rewarded for that. Bearing in mind, we've still got to make sure we protect people who can't be flexible in how they use energy. So that shows how the path's the same. But I think as we touched on before, that all needs to be underpinned by bill support, because regardless of all those good things, bills are going to stay high for a period to come. So we need a well-designed, permanent solution for bill support, which involves some clever data matching between household income that the government potentially can compile and data sharing with the suppliers to make sure we have a targeted bill support underpinning the road to net zero.
Great, lovely. Tons of things to pick up on. Maybe, actually, Andy, where you ended is a great place to start. So we're in a place where the traditional support schemes for people who are struggling with their bills never really envisioned energy prices at the level that they're at. Obviously, we're at over the previous winter and could potentially stay relatively high and also stay volatile through this decade. And so what a lot of people in the energy markets are saying is we need a sort of more durable scheme that isn't doesn't let people wonder from time to time or sort of from year to year what their support level will look like, and also is sort of resilient to volatility in the markets that sort of can adapt as the markets go up and go down. A lot of people have been sort of terming it a social tariff, but there are lots of different, you can call it what you want. Maybe sort of question of the panel, if we are going down the route of a social tariff, and that's not a given, what does it look like, and some of the basic questions around who should fund it, how should it be funded, what should the level look like, and ultimately, how is this going to be delivered through customers? Is it sort of energy companies off your bill? Is it the tax discount to customers? Curious for everybody's thoughts on that. Take it away.
Happy to start off. So I think there's, for us, there would be two things to think about. One is short term, what do we do this winter? And then two is long term, what's the role of price protection in this market? Is there a role, and if so, what does it look like? I think in terms of short term, then there are some simple things that could be done. For example, one thing that we've talked to government about is an extension of the warm homes discount, so that both in terms of the value and the reach of the warm homes discount could be extended, as an example, from 150 to 300 pounds, and in terms of the reach to cover those people who are currently on means tested benefits. In terms of funding, then you can look at that in a number of ways. So we don't believe that should be social, that the cost of that should be applied to the energy bill. That's regressive. If it's to be entirely funded by government, then fund it through general taxation, but make it time limited. There are interestingly, in other markets in which we work, there are very interesting models. So if I look at the Dutch market, for example, there is a model in the Dutch market that was in place last winter and is in place this winter, where a similar sort of scheme is co-funded by the participants in the market and government. And if I look around the suppliers, who are all, Philippe's touched on what EDF are doing, I've touched on what we're doing, everybody is doing something. And is there a better way to target that funding and to co-fund? There's a model in the Netherlands, as I say. Short term. Long term, I think you have to look at what the role of price protection is. Personally, I don't believe that the price cap as it's currently constructed is fit for purpose anymore. I think there is an ongoing role for price protection for those people who need it most. But if I look at the price cap at the moment, it treats me in exactly the same way as a family on a very low income. And if I look at the role of the price cap at the moment, what you see is that the regulator has become the market, has become the price setter. You see that that is having an impact on the hedging path that suppliers take. And I would question whether or not the construct of the price cap as it is today is actually having a detrimental role in the level of competition that you see in the market. So I think it's two things. Short term, some ideas. Long term, we need to revisit the market construct and what the role of price protection is.
I would like to build on what Chris has said. First of all, we did recently a survey to question the customers whether or not they are in favor of a social tariff. Basically, there is only 3% within this survey of people that were against the idea of a social tariff. And maybe to give an idea of where the heart of the people that have answered this survey were, more than 55% of them thought that it would be more fair to be funded through the general taxation. Now, thinking about a social tariff, the first question is who would be eligible to a social tariff? And when we look at the different countries where EDF is operating across Europe, there is a common behavior, which is always to have a priority register for people that are eligible to support from the government, whatever are the type of utilities, whatever are the type of services, which is governmental led. It's important for firemen, it's important for the utilities, it's important for the NHS to have a central register where the people the most in need are registered. And that can effectively to target this type of support. That can also, reduce the level of support when there is not enough money to fund for them. The second question is, what would it look like, in fact, a social tariff? I think when you look at the vulnerable customers, there are two types of customers. One have very low consumption, and then there is the questions about the standing charge. Why on earth the standing charge for electricity last year has increased by 107%? And the reason is you need to look back at history. It's a consultation that was led in 2017 that decided in 2019 this change in the way the unit price is built for the electricity. So I hope that we will be faster in unwinding this type of things. That's for the low consumers. For the high consumers, there is the thought about the unit price. How can we reduce the unit price and how it can be financed? Obviously, that's once again questions. But I go back to the survey that we did.
No, thank you. So there's a couple of observations. So I think we probably need to separate out price protection from bill support. Price protection is about fairness, not affordability, whereas bill support is about affordability. And in terms of concentrating on bill support, what we've suggested is some sort of approach that takes into account both household income and size of bills, and you can calibrate across those two to provide an answer. But where I'll allow some of my personal frustrations to come out, where I think that tends to fall down is on practicality, and that this household income data isn't available. And I've been led to believe by some people that to do this piece of work, to get household income data, would take somewhere like 9 to 12 months. And I think I was first discussing this certainly over a year ago. So you look back on it now, you realise if we'd started then, we would now have the household income data, which then lets you target people who aren't in receipt of benefits, but are on low income. So that piece of work to get household income data to allow the targeting, if nothing else, that needs to start off. We did a commission into what bill support could look like, and it was some time ago, so it was when bills were higher than they are now, but we did see at that point, and I accept it's a slightly different context now, we saw a high degree of public support for you talked about amounts of bill support. We saw a high degree of public support for that £1,000 as being the size of source support. That was on bills that were over 3,000, I accept, so it's a different context. Then my final point about the design is any support we do give, we don't want to disengage customers. We need to do it in a way that still allows consumers to engage with the market. So if there are better deals out there, to still be incentivised to go for them, and also if they can be rewarded for being more flexible, make sure we're not reducing the incentives for that, which I think means you look at sort of fixed pounds discounts rather than pence per kilowatt hour discounts. Keep that incentive to engage.
All helpful. Yeah, I mean, on those points, it's interesting from the consumer perspective. I mean, great to sort of separate out support for people who are on lower incomes and may not be able to afford their energy bills versus price protection for the general market. The current structure of the price cap, I mean, we've come out relatively strongly against it in its current form, about particularly given its effects on competition. But one of the things that we need in the energy market is innovation, right? And of course, a lot of that is dynamic tariffs, that, things like market-wide half-hourly settlement will certainly enable. But so much of that is a customer response, right? And if you look at the history of the price cap, the original problem it's brought in to solve is you have this sort of bulk of, referred to as back book of customers who essentially find it difficult to understand what makes up their energy bill, how it's calculated, and essentially how they can save money, and thus that sort of customer disengagement, I think, is one of the things if we want to move to a more flexible energy system, to the sort of tariffs where you charge your EV overnight and even half-hourly sort of charging. I guess my question, sort of relatively broad one, is how do we tackle better that customer disengagement and sort of help people understand here's what your energy bills look like, here's how you could save money if you wanted to, it's funny, trying to explain to somebody what a kilowatt hour is and their eyes start to sort of go back in their head. I wonder if the panel has any thoughts on that.
I don't mind.
Please.
Yeah, no, I think it goes wider than tariffs. It goes across the whole of consumers engaging with net zero. We do need some sort of engagement strategy, which I think has to start centrally. So there's a bit about, for want of a better phrase, public information. So something like a public information campaign. Then also we see as key part a coordinated and coherent approach to advice, so consumers know where they would go to get independent advice. I think that includes tariffs, but goes across all the changes that we needed for net zero.
I think just to pick up on some points about targeting support, I think you have a difficulty in political parties where, first of all, we're on election cycles. So long-term thinking, as much as Rishi Sunak likes to say that's his that's the catchphrase of the conference, is sometimes quite difficult because it's always about winning votes. And I think what's interesting is this time last year we had Liz Truss, and she pushed the energy price guarantee. Now that was not means tested, and a lot of Tories felt that was not the right decision because it gave a discount to people who didn't need it necessarily, regardless of whether you think it was right or wrong. But what's really interesting is now, fast forward a year later, over the weekend there was a big debate around the winter fuel allowance for pensioners. And that is not means tested. And the consensus was then, are we going to drop it? Are we going to keep it? And the consensus was, let's keep it. Now that, to an extent, could be seen as a kind of cynical move to do with the fact that pensioners tend more to vote Tory, and therefore they are a voter group that needs to be protected. So I think the issue is you have this kind of tension between, you know, whether something might be means tested and how that would be implemented and how that would work, mixed with targeting particular groups of voters that are useful to you, and trying to find a way for those to mesh is quite difficult when you're trying to win an election. You might disagree with me. But
Yeah, I think that's a great opportunity for me to come in. Look, first of all, I would say, just as I said right at the beginning, the long-term solution to this is to rebalance our energy mix. That is ultimately what we need to do as a country. And as I said right at the beginning, we're making great progress on that. And that's where, you know, Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister has placed a great deal of emphasis in the policies that he's announced. And that will hopefully be continued long into the future, no matter who's in power. And I won't go into all the different things we're doing to mobilise private capital to enable that to happen, but there's a lot going on to ensure that that long-term solution is in place and we make progress even quicker than we have been doing recently. Energy efficiency is quite rightly something that's been mentioned as one of the solutions to reducing energy costs for households. We've announced £6 billion of taxpayer money to help incentivise and encourage that. We've also reduced things like VAT on solar panels. So if you own a home and you want to put solar panels on your home, you can do so at a reduced rate of VAT. So there are things that we're doing to spend taxpayer money to incentivise energy efficiency improvements, because that is a really important part of this puzzle. But I just want to really tackle this point about the most vulnerable in our society, because any government, you would hope, and certainly this government, is focused on ensuring that when times are particularly hard, when there's a shock to our system, the government's got your back. And on the back of the situation in Ukraine, as we know, inflation across the world increased, and energy prices in particular increased in this country more than they did in other countries because of that energy balance that I talked about. But we stepped in with the energy price guarantee to the tune of around £40 billion. We effectively paid 50% of people's energy bills for a period when wholesale gas prices were very high. And it's interesting that nobody's yet mentioned that on this panel, because that's a significant amount of public spending that we decided to implement for households at a really challenging time. But whenever we implement policies, as you would expect, as taxpayers, we've got to balance the need to support the most vulnerable while also ensuring that we've got sustainable public finances. That is the right thing to do. And as easy as it would be to write a blank cheque and a cheque that goes on in perpetuity, that is not the responsible thing to do for any government. But it is important to acknowledge that we also have targeted schemes, very targeted schemes, to ensure that the most vulnerable in society have additional capital going into this winter, whether it's the cost of living payments, which equate to around £900 per household, the Warm Homes discount in particular. Those are schemes that I would just stress are, again, taxpayer money that's going to support the most vulnerable in society at a time of elevated prices. The good news is that prices are coming significantly down, and I just re-emphasise that's why the number one priority of the government is to get inflation down, because this makes everybody poorer, but it especially impacts those most vulnerable.
Thanks, Gareth. And yeah, the 40 billion figure, it's funny, you know, during COVID, the cost of the furlough scheme, that was a huge talking point in the media for such a long time. And then, as you point out, Truss government and then Rishi's government putting in place, you know, schemes on a similar magnitude in terms of cost of the public purse, and yet somehow there hasn't been nearly the same level of acknowledgement of just how much staggering amount of money the government has spent subsidizing the energy bills of everybody up and down the country this past winter. We can't do this every year. This cannot be, like, that's not a sustainable model. And so I guess to your broader point of the ultimate way that we're going to bring bills down is investing in renewable energy. There are sort of initiatives in place across government. I mean, we rightly point out we're one of the leaders on offshore wind. We've had the contracts for difference in place for quite a while, and yet the rest of the world is waking up, right? Biden in the United States with the Inflation Reduction Act, the EU, sort of Green Deal. Suddenly this race for capital around the world is hotting up, and we, the UK, need to stay competitive if we want the investment that will drive bills down and ultimately create jobs and level up and sort of complete the economic transformation that we hope net zero can bring. So I guess curious for the panel's views on what the UK is doing and should be doing to try to attract more investment.
Can I just come in on that? I just want to pick up on something you said and pull you up on it, because you said, clearly one of the answers is to move forward on renewable energy, and that is completely right. As I said, 40% of our electricity last year was generated from renewables. But it's also about the investments that we're making in nuclear, which is going to be a critical part of the component to rebalancing our energy mix. And it's also about, oil and gas. And that's why I re-emphasise my point that we have a clear, I'd love to work with the Labour Party to open their eyes to the fact that we do need oil and gas for years to come. And it is not right, it is not responsible, it will cost too much for everybody if we stop production of oil and gas. This is part of the solution, not just to reduce energy bills, but towards our transition. And you're quite right, by the way, on big issues, we should work together as much as we possibly can. But there is a very clear difference between what we think when it comes to rebalancing our energy mix, achieving energy security and our climate ambitions, and what the opposition think. They want to add borrowing at a significant rate, £28 billion a year. They want to cut off oil and gas production at a cost to people who are employed in that sector to the tune of 210,000 people nationally. We just don't think that's right. And when we have a clear disagreement, and the British people are going to have a choice on this next year, I think it's important that we stress what those differences are.
Anybody else want to come in? Chris?
Mind just repeating the question?
Priorities for attracting, essentially, if you had a magic wand, in terms of attracting investor capital to the UK to help invest in our energy system, and you rightly point out, certainly not just renewables across the piece, what should we be doing?
Got it. No, that's fine. Look, personally, I would agree with the Minister in many ways in terms of the need to rebalance the energy mix in the UK. And I would certainly agree with the points made in terms of the investment in renewables, but also the need to rebalance the energy mix. I think if I'm honest, I think that Mhari's point impacts investor confidence. So it's disappointing to see that over the course of the last few months, energy has become a topic which has been imbued with some of the characteristics of the culture war debate that we see going on. That directly impacts investor confidence. So I can speak very personally. We had our supervisory board with us in the UK last week in London. They were super positive about the business, what we've done to turn the business around. They were super concerned about some of the political rhetoric and political narrative that they see coming from the UK. And I was at great pains to reassure them that actually, if you talk to government, then you look below those headlines, you look below that narrative, you talk to government, then what you get is a rational response. And actually what you've got is a rational discussion with government. But I would prefer not to be having to have the discussion that says look below those headlines, because that's making, and we have live investment proposals into the UK that are significant, that we're asking them to consider now. And the point there in terms of the nature of the rhetoric and the nature of the debate isn't always helpful. So that would be one thing. As I said, if you look below the line, I do believe that there is a rational response that we get. It's how do we surface that more often? And the second thing, I would come back to the point in terms of, yes, there's a need to rebalance the energy mix, but an investment, a significant and I would say greater than is currently available in significant investment in energy efficiency in the UK, long-term policy certainty about that. Certainly from some of the studies that we've done, drives it, not only will it bring people's bills down permanently, but that type of investment that we are ready and willing to make will have a significant economic benefit for the UK. The return for every pound spent in the UK is material, is significant, £3.20 for every pound spent on energy efficiency in the UK, hundreds of thousands of good skilled jobs created. And then if you broaden out and you look at what positive effect might that have for other calls on the public finances, then you look at the health benefits, you look at the benefits that people get from living in warm, well-insulated homes, and then those are significant. So the call on funding for the health service, the call on funding for social care reduces in proportion to the level of investment that you make in the energy efficiency of homes. So narrative, and sorry to keep coming back to the point, take the point, absolutely agree with the Minister on rebalancing the energy mix, but one of the fastest paybacks is the investment in energy efficiency.
I would like to intervene and try to answer this question with 3 points. The first one is, I can't praise enough the government for the support that you are providing on Sizewell. And we are hand in hand, in fact, to make this investment for the UK. That's a massive investment of 20 billion that we are working on right now to deliver. So I feel a little party pre, in fact, in answering this question with this type of support, but thank you, Gareth. The second thing that I would like to mention is when I look at our renewable business, and we've got a huge footprint in renewable in the UK as well, because we believe that the future is effectively this right balance between having a base load with nuclear, but also very cheap energy thanks to wind and solar. And when I look at the reasons for being to face difficulties in investing into renewables today, it's because of uncertainty. Uncertainty when, and uncertainty how much it will cost to deliver, in fact, a project. And that's a big issue, in fact, when we negotiate with large companies to sign corporate PPAs, to do not know when it will be delivered because of the time it takes, especially to wire, in fact, the renewable sites that we are building, and how much it will cost. So there is really a big issue here, which is to create effectively incentives to lower this type of risks which are linked with grid connections. The third point I would like to make is we won't have the ability to invest in the future if we don't have also, as you have pointed out in your previous question, the ability to innovate in the supply business. And to be innovative in the supply business, we need, as a supplier, to make profits. So it's fair to say that the industry over the last 4 years after the introduction of the price cap has made losses. In fact, more than 35 suppliers have gone bust. That's very well known. And if we are going to make a profit this year, it will be because of some alliances that Ofgem has granted to us to recover some of the losses that we have made in the past year. So if we want to invest in the future, to be innovative, to help our customers to embrace EV, to embrace heat pumps, to renovate their households, to innovate in the type of tariffs that we can provide to them, we need effectively to have an healthy market from a financial point of view. That's extremely important to, I think, question how the price cap can be sustainable and give resilience for the suppliers in the future.
Just to build on and echo Philippe's point, it's really important that, I think going back to your previous question, which we didn't quite come to maybe, which was on investment in the demand side of energy and flexibility on the demand side of energy. I think the point the Minister made earlier, there's a supply and demand equation. And yes, there's a need to rebalance the energy mix on the supply side. There's also a lot more that can be done on the demand side. And to drive investment and to create the conditions for investment in that flexible energy world, suppliers have to be able to make an appropriate margin. And our residential business in the UK has lost money 4 years out of the last 5, and by the benchmarking that we get, we're one of the most efficient suppliers in the UK. That is, yes, we're in the business of managing volatility in many ways and managing volatility for customers, but that's not volatility. That's something else. So I think I completely agree with Philippe. I think you have to be able to make a small appropriate margin through the supply business. That creates the conditions that creates better investment conditions to invest in the demand side of energy, to invest in a flexible energy system, to give customers energy independence, to bring bills down over the long term. That's really important here. I think there's also a role that the government can play in taking a long-term view, not to provide, not to use sticks, but actually to provide a better structure of its system of incentives and a better carrot for people. So we could, there's an opportunity to look at the tax system, for example, to look at, for example, the way that stamp duty works, to incentivize customers, to work with suppliers, to improve, but not just the energy efficiency, but also to make investments in some of those flexible solutions that you touched on earlier. And that in turn will make the job of all of us easier when it comes to adjusting the energy mix in the UK. So there's quite a few things I feel passionate about that are important to pick up.
And do you want to come in?
Please. So picking up on supplier profits, I think we've all been agreeing too much, so now I'll stop. Stop agreeing. So I think we believe the supply market is going to flip into profitability this year, and I think we do have concerns that the retail price cap, well, certainly I have concerns that that's not a way of delivering a view of what the efficient costs of supply was. That's obviously competition should reveal the efficient, and without competition, I think there are real concerns that the retail price cap won't deliver efficient costs, and we're concerned that it becomes a lobbyist charter. So the level of the retail price cap has been increased repeatedly for various different decisions, which I won't go into, and we have a real fear that becomes suppliers can continually go back to, we've got this risk has increased, can we have some more profit, etc., etc. So I think there is a concern that retail price cap won't deliver efficient costs, which is obviously what we want competition to do. And my own observation, the bit I struggle with supplier profits is that there's a very big range of supplier profits. So we know that Exchequer reported record profits for their supply business, which I think even if you look across current years, I accept a big chunk of that is catch up, but if you look across the 2 years, they're still very high profits. So I think at some point, someone needs to explain how one supplier can make very healthy profits and whilst the sector's in loss. Now I know Ofgem have been working on this and maybe they can't share it, but there's a very clear question that needs to be answered there in the supplier profit discussion.
Maybe, yeah, we've been sort of continuing to mention the price cap, and I think the future of pricing regulation is something, obviously we, the CPS, have been thinking quite a bit about, where you have the situation where a policy that was brought in essentially to protect a specific group of customers who are disengaged and, as a result of not being able to look at their bills or sort of can't really understand it, effectively using the price cap as sort of a proxy for competition. But of course, there's meant to be substantial competition below the cap. If you want a discount, you should be able to go out to the market and find it. And we're now in a situation where almost everybody in this room is on a price cap tariff. And competition has all but disappeared in, at least on price, in a lot of the retail market. We've sort of campaigned a bit on this issue, and while I think most people in the energy markets would agree that the price cap is essentially has gone far beyond what it was originally intended to do, the big question becomes, what do you replace it with, right? Originally, when the price cap was being introduced, all of suppliers favored a relative tariff. So essentially, it's you set a percentage between your most expensive and your least expensive tariff, and you have to stay in that range. Other people advocate just have Ofgem publish a reference price, and that sort of provides enough effect for competition. There's a ban on acquisition-only tariffs that Ofgem has in place, and maybe that sort of proxies competition for these sort of disengaged customers. But I'm curious, if not the current version of the price cap, what replaces it? I know, it's a big question. Anybody like to take a bite?
You seem to be looking at me. I mean, look, I think, unfortunately, trying to find some disagreement, we can't guess I think everybody would, on this panel, from what I've heard, would agree that the price cap in its current form doesn't work. Doesn't work for customers, doesn't work for suppliers, doesn't work for society, and you've heard Jonathan Brearley's doesn't believe it works from a regulatory perspective either. So I think we'd all agree with that. I think there are different models, as you set out, in terms of what you could move to. A personal view would be that there are some simple, there's a long term and there's a short term. There's some simple things that we could do relatively easily in the short term. For example, whilst I understand the reasons behind the move to a quarterly review of the price cap, actually what that's done has had a negative impact on customers because of the impact it has on the hedging on the hedging strategies of suppliers. When I contrast that with what I see, for example, in Germany or in the Netherlands, the nature of the price shock over the last 18 months there has been longer but much shallower, and that's as a direct result of the way, one of the drivers of that is the way that the price cap has been constructed here. So I think you can change that. I think the other thing that we could then, that we then need to discuss and we need to have a proper debate around is actually, if you look at the future energy world that you described, there are some new value pools there. New value pools, whether it be driven by people who have EV, people who have PV, people who at the moment can't actually participate in the market because they can't afford to. And let's have a look at the way that we construct the market and regulate the market that incentivises those new value pools to grow, whilst at the same time providing a degree of protection. And I would take issue with protection versus affordability, because in the mind of the customer, a price cap's designed to make things affordable for me, but it's not. So look at the new value pools, work out the regulatory scheme that works to incentivise those to grow so that people can participate, work out the way to make sure that there is a degree of price protection for those people who can't engage at the moment.
Andy?
I don't know the answer to the design, unfortunately, but no one else does, so that makes me feel comfortable.
Indeed.
I think my observation would be the reasons why we the price cap was brought in. I think they seem to be still evident to me, and the market looks like it's gone through a cycle and is looking much more like. Obviously, we had the big six, then we had lots of market entrants flooding in who have now exited the market. So in many ways, it does look similar to how it did before that point. So it's not obvious to me that the conditions that necessitated the price cap coming in have gone away. So it seems that price protection of some form is necessary, but a review is sensible.
Yeah, maybe. Personally, my view is that the market is extremely complex, and to have a single solution like the price cap is not the solution. So obviously the market has to be segmented, and as we said, for the most vulnerable customers, there is a need for protection. So that looks obvious. And the reason for the price cap to have been introduced wasn't to shield, in fact, the most vulnerable customers. It was just to avoid that the suppliers achieve non-reasonable profits. So there are other ways, in fact, to, I think, regulate profits, obviously, especially in the supply business, that could be considered without, hampering and having this kind of cap, which drove, in fact, some, I think, from my point of view, unhealthy competition. Because the reason for those 30 or 40 suppliers to go bust is because they have taken risks in order to try to beat the price cap. They just bet that the wholesale market will always decrease, so they could buy later energy that they have sold. And unfortunately, when the price went up, obviously they felt by themselves, facing the price which was rising. They needed to sell the energy at the price that they have agreed with the customers, and they have to buy in the market at a higher price the energy that they have sold. So to take this type of risks, you need to have flexibility, and the price cap does not afford, in fact, this flexibility. And customers need to understand that, so it requires regulation. So I don't know about I don't know what is the solution. Personally, I think that competition is good and healthy when it's properly driven, when customers are aware, when there is protections also, and when obviously, there is not unfair profits that are made by the suppliers. But it requires basically to have a big discussions, I think, across the industry.
Fair enough. Great. We'd love to open up to questions if anybody has any. Sorry, gentleman just at the front. There's a microphone. We're going to do two at a time, so if we can take your question and then the lady just behind you.
William James, Arundel and South Downs. My question is this: I understand that China and India are still building coal-fired power stations. How much of the cost of our energy today is attributable to the cost of the drive to net zero?
And the lady just behind there.
Hi, Alexa Phillips at the Telegraph. I'm wondering if this is for the Minister Minister, but also welcome to chime in with the rest of the panel. Standing charges, there's concerns about those continuing to go up. A lot of people think it's an unfair increase because it's not based on consumption. Is the government sort of looking at that as an issue? Is that something that might sort of change? And yeah, what do the other panelists think? Do you agree with Octopus Energy, I think, has said that that should be reviewed? So I'm just wondering if there's support for that on the panel as well.
Okay. Cost net zero and standing charges. Who wants to?
Please.
Gareth.
No, I want to hear what you say. Please, after you.
I just wanted to jump on the questions about the standing charge. The standing charge, in fact, the increase is once again a decision which has been made in 2019. It's a decision that the cost of transport and distribution of electricity be not paid on a volumetric basis, but on a pound per customer per day. It's a decision which was made at that time, in fact. So we could go back to the previous period of time, which was, in fact, 1 year ago, because it took 4 years to implement this decision. And we are extremely supportive, obviously, to unwind it. Right now, it's absolutely inappropriate and aggressive for the low consumers.
Okay, I'll just pick up on standing charges. It is a balanced debate, but it's quite right that standing charges are poor for low-consuming customers. But if you change them, you do cause detriment for high-consuming users. It's just a maths thing, isn't it? So if you use below average, you'll be better off if you remove standing charges a bit higher. So you've got any consumer who uses more than average, which will include medically dependent consumers, will be worse off if you rebalance between standing charges and variable charges. And the impact on those individual consumers will be higher as well. So and then also, the final point in standing charges is that if you put more into unit rates, then that will favour those people who have got energy efficiency employed or have got solar panels, and those consumers tend to be the more affluent, so you are also doing something that's slightly regressive. So I think it's a difficult debate, but I think it is a balanced debate, and I don't think the answer is obviously get rid of standing charges. I think it's more balanced than that.
I mean, that's absolutely the critical point. It's easy, you know, in principle we would agree that there are better solutions than the standing charge, but you have to bear two things in mind. Often that, you know, if you then just simply if you simply put the cost put those charges into the unit rate, then people who have medical care at home often have higher levels of energy use and will be directly impacted and suffer directly. And people who live in poorer quality houses, which are often the more vulnerable members of society, will be negatively impacted as well. So to simply say, as some do, that we just need to get rid of the standing charge without a complementary set of solutions around how do you improve the quality of the housing stock, what support do you offer for those people who have that medical care at home, then you run the risk of inadvertently negatively impacting those members of society. So in principle, yes, but you really need to, those 2 points need careful thought.
Gareth, you want to go in?
Yeah, so just on the standing charges, you'll forgive me, this is a lead really for the Department for Energy Security, but I do know that, as you've heard already, there's a lot of engagement going on, there's lots of different opinions on this, so as you would expect there is engagement, and something I monitor as well from within the Treasury, but don't have anything revelationary to tell you today. But I do want to just address this question, because you raise an interesting point. I think today, because of our efforts to decarbonise, and by the way, we're the fastest decarbonising country in the G7. I think we've decarbonised by about 48% since 1990. So we've got a very strong record, as I've said. And the result of that has meant that actually, as a country, the UK contributes around, I think, less than 1% of global emissions. So you are right to emphasise the fact that this is a global challenge, and we require everybody to play their part as we transition to what we all want, I think, in this country, which is a decarbonised economy by 2050. And that's why forums such as COP, we've got one coming up very soon this year, are very important for holding other countries to account so that they follow our lead. But I do want to address one specific point that you made around, is this costing, are our efforts to transition costing people more? And I think overall, long term, this will be much better for consumers of energy because, as I've said, if we rebalance our energy mix, it will get cheaper for people longer term, and we will become less dependent on foreign imports. For example, if we cut off oil and gas production domestically, ironically, that will put up emissions, it will make us more dependent on foreign nations' energy, and that will cost the country and consumers far more. So I think as we decarbonise towards renewables, that will help. But what we don't want to do as we get to 2050 is overly burden families, businesses, individuals with unrealistic and disproportionate actions. And that's why the Prime Minister made the announcements that he did last week. It's called rhetoric, but what he did was basically bring us into line with the EU off a very strong base and leadership in the United Kingdom over many decades. And in that announcement, by the way, and nobody has yet mentioned this again, but he announced a 50% increase for the boiler upgrade scheme. That's a £7,500 package of taxpayer-funded support for people who want to upgrade their boilers. And so, and by the way, the other thing he announced was a speeding up of the planning process. So, you know, the rhetoric, as has been described, is one of pragmatism, proportionality, and realism based on discussions about, and this is my final point, about what you were saying on the supply chain. Because ultimately, if we do want to rebalance our energy mix, we do need all of these different energy projects to be able to connect to the grid. It's currently a 14-year wait for an energy project to connect to the grid. And so one of the things that the Prime Minister announced whenever it was a couple of weeks ago, time goes fast, but recently, was that we want to speed up the process of planning, but we want to really speed up the process of connecting to the grid, get rid of these zombies in the queue to connect to the grid and increase capacity. But supply chain issues is something that is a pervasive issue. Just to give you an example as relates to the grid, there are 4 high voltage cable companies in the world. And every country is trying to do this, right? Every country is trying to expand their grid capacity, and we are having problems with our supply chain. And so that's why one of the reasons he delayed the announcement on the vehicles is because businesses have told us that the supply chain is not there yet. So it allows businesses to build up the supply chain, ease the burden on families in the short term as we all get to net zero in the long term.
If I may, I think part of the question is if the UK hasn't closed coal power stations, as an example, EDF used to run some coal power station, or reduced our dependency on CCGT with the development of solar, nuclear, etc., would that it change the price of energy? And the answer is no. The answer is no, because the gas market is a worldwide market. In fact, especially with the LNG, the exchanges are worldwide. So in fact, we are dependent on prices that are achieved at a global level. There is no specific market for the UK. And it means that basically, you know, all the rise that we have seen on our bills are rise that are seen everywhere across the world.
Sorry, Mhari.
And I was just going to say, I think also the kind of political calculation that's being made about your point about the fact that moving to net zero, people are concerned about the price of it and how much it's going to cost them on their day-to-day lives. We saw in the Uxbridge by-election what happened when people felt that they were being taxed or charged too much for certain kind of green policies. And I think the government's gamble is that they are hoping Labour will alienate voters by trying to push them into a green agenda, whereas I think the government's gamble is trying to take people with them and therefore slowing that down slightly in a way that feels proportionate and reasonable. The question is, we also know that the general public in general are quite pro-green policies and green, trying to do better things for climate change, but it's really a question of to what extent are people willing to be out of pocket to improve the environmental landscape in the UK. And I think that is what Rishi Sunak's gambling on, is that hopefully people will vote with what they feel is reasonable, what they can afford at the time.
Fair enough. All right, afraid we're going to have to wrap it up there because we're a few minutes over. But thanks so much for everybody for coming, to our sponsors, EOF and E.ON for being sponsoring this event. And if you want to stick around, at 2:15 we have Grant Shapps in conversation with Ian Martin on UK Defence Policy. Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody.